So we've talked a lot about aggregate demand and monetary policy. Here I just want to spend a few minutes talking about fiscal policy, and I think the text probably takes care of this and really focuses on the pieces that are most interesting or most important to you. So what I just want to do here is kind of review some of the thought process here on fiscal policy. What are we specifically talking about? Well, we're talking about policy of the government itself. Policy of the government itself, right? Itself. And what are the policy what are the main policy tools that the government has? Well, the government has two things that it does, right? Specifically, it can be broken into two different categories. It collects taxes, right? And it has spending. And we know that when taxes are greater than spending, we would have a government that would be running a fiscal surplus, right? When we have a government that is spending in excess of its tax base, that means that it would have a fiscal deficit. And that deficit spending is sometimes also discussed as kind of fiscal stimulus. And so this would be where you're borrowing to try to stimulate demand. And that really gets at kind of what we've been generally talking about. So we'll put this out here real generically. I'll put the model here where we know that we've got kind of why we have real output on the x-axis. We have the price level here on the y-axis, right? And as we've thought about this, we've got aggregate demand, which is downward sloping as a result of the wealth effect and the interest rate effect and the exchange rate effect. The interest rate effect being the most important one here for the American economy, obviously. And then we've got the two curves of aggregate supply here, right? We've got I got a little messy there. Let me undo that and let's redo this. We've got long run aggregate supply, right? And then we've got kind of short run aggregate supply, which I didn't do that very well. Let's see if we can get it right through there. We've got the short run aggregate supply that's kind of bisecting where we would have this equilibrium rate, right? And this was where we would have an equilibrium price level and kind of our natural level of output. And we've discussed kind of all of this before in a few different ways. Now what I want to think through is what is happening to aggregate demand as the government is changing these things? Well, there's a few different things that we can think about. So the first is that what is it that individuals do, right? So individuals have some sort of money and they have kind of two options with that money, right? They can spend it, in the most general case, they can spend their money or they can save their money. And we have kind of a term that we use when we think about the spending, and this is the marginal propensity to consume, right? This is how much consumption there is. And if we remember, what is aggregate demand? Well, aggregate demand is the consumption, it's the investment, right? It's the government expenditures, it's the net exports, it's the total amount of goods and services that are demanded by consumers, by firms, by the government, and by foreign entities within an economy. And if we think about kind of what are the things that could stimulate demand, well, there's a few different things that the government can do, right? And in the most basic case, if the government reduces taxes to stimulate demand, right? If it reduces taxes, then what is it doing? Well, in essence, if you're an individual and your tax rate, let's say that you were previously being taxed at 30% on your income, and instead this is reduced to 25% on your income. What do you now have? Well, you now have more money that you can go and you can do one of two things with that money, right? You can put more money in savings or you can put more money in spending, right? You can spend more money. This breakdown, this marginal propensity to consume, let's say that doesn't change at all, right? Let's say that this amount of spending doesn't, the rate of spending and saving doesn't change all that much, but we can think about what actually happens here in the economy, right? Which is if we reduce taxes, we should see an increase in the aggregate demand curve. And we can also, I'll just kind of draw this out here real quick, right? Because we can also see how the aggregate demand curve, if we just mark that as aggregate demand 2, how we're going to have short run and long run implications here, right? That increase in the price level is going to then affect businesses, and we can think about changes that might happen in short run aggregate supply, which we've discussed previously. But we can also think about maybe there's some sort of thing that has happened in the economy that has actually reduced aggregate demand, and this is what we see often. We will see reduction in aggregate demand where maybe kind of from a recession or a depression where there's less spending, less consumer spending, less investment spending in the government, or I'm sorry, by individuals and businesses, and the aggregate demand curve actually is over here to the left. And what would we want to do? Well, there's a few different ways that we can stimulate the economy, right? So one would be lowering taxes. I think that makes sense. If we just lower taxes, you have more money that you can spend, and as a result, we would see aggregate demand at every given price level expand to the right. But one of the other things we can do is we can increase spending. And if we increase spending, what do we have here? Well, if we increase spending, in essence, that's this G here, right? That's the government spending in and of itself. And if the government spends, it is going to kind of force aggregate demand to the right. In essence, it is often discussed as kind of expansionary, or you also hear it as a fiscal stimulus. These are terms that you hear kind of all the time, particularly over the last kind of 6 to 7 years as we've gone through the recession and kind of the recovery from the recession. We've had a government that has spent trillions of dollars trying to kind of expand the aggregate demand through spending on programs, Medicare, right, kind of healthcare spending, on automatic stabilizers, things like unemployment benefits that come into effect immediately when you lose your job. The government doesn't have to do anything. It just immediately happens. And we've also previously looked at kind of lowering taxes as well as a way to put more money into individuals' pockets. The main way that we lowered taxes over the last few years was we lowered the payroll tax, which is kind of the amount of taxes that are going to Medicare and Social Security, some of those mandatory programs that we think about in the economy. So again, just kind of a few things that we think about that can impact the fiscal policy or that can impact aggregate demand here. I bring up marginal propensity to consume because you've probably seen kind of the thing that comes out of this is the multiplier effect. And the multiplier effect, this is really just, right, the multiplier effect is that when we have money that is dumped into the economy, that money can then be, right, there's a multiplier to that money. There's a multiplier to that effect on the economy because let's say that the government increases its spending by by $100 billion or so, we will actually see more than that in the aggregate demand as a result of this multiplier effect. And we can kind of think through why that would be the case. You also see another kind of, if this continues to expand, right, so let's say from this you would see an aggregate demand shift to the right. We also have crowding out. And the crowding out effect, right, the crowding out effect is that, well, as aggregate demand kind of expands to the right, we would also see kind of this offsetting increase in the interest rate, and that would have a little bit of a decrease in the aggregate demand. These are kind of dual aggregate demand effects that we would see here, and so there's some kind of economists who think that this crowding out effect from government spending is actually relatively big and that it would actually cause aggregate demand to contract a little bit, to come back in, to move to the left. Both of these are kind of, you can do a little bit of more research on these and kind of think through them. We're not going to spend a lot of time going through them and thinking through them in general. I think that they're relatively self-explanatory. What I mostly want to focus on is that the things that can affect expansionary fiscal policy, aggregate demand that would really kind of increase this would be anything that would increase kind of consumption and investment, obviously, right? Lowering taxes would do that. And we can increase spending for the government as well. Anything that is spending related or taxes related, that is definitely what we refer to as fiscal policy. Anything that is money supply or interest rate related, that would be monetary policy, and that's really the purview of the Federal Reserve. So just a quick kind of primer on thinking through fiscal policy versus monetary policy.